Welcome to the Peace Catalyst podcast, where we share stories to inspire, uplift, and encourage you in your peacemaking journey. I'm Becca Tyvel, and I work with Peace Catalyst International in the Washington, D.C. area, but I'm spending a few months here in South Africa due to my husband's work. So I'm joining you all from South Africa again. And as always, I'm joined by my co-host, Allie Burnison.
Hey guys, I'm Allie and I'm with PCI in Los Angeles, California. If you enjoy the podcast, please do us a favor and take some time to rate and review the podcast on Apple Podcasts. It just really helps boost our visibility and encourages others to give us a listen. And yeah, it just helps us be found. So thanks guys for doing that.
Yeah, thank you all for doing that. And, we're in the middle of our series called Becoming the Beloved Community, Restoration and Healing in the Midst of Division. And this is rooted in the historical origin of the civil rights movement and Martin Luther King Jr. And it's the concept of becoming the beloved community is what is framing our conversations. And we're talking to people whom we call peace builders, who are involving themselves in the ministry of reconciliation, interrupting and challenging oppression, and holding firmly to a vision of justice, restoration, peace, and healing for all members of a community.
And this week, we are talking to another amazing guest. So we're interviewing Jeanelle Austin, who is a racial justice coach and has over 15 years of experience in facilitating group conversations on race, designing racism and multicultural educational programs, mentoring individuals, and supporting institutional leadership as they think through strategies to take seriously diversity and inclusion and integration. Jeanelle is also the lead caretaker of the George Floyd Memorial and, along with George Floyd's family, co-founded the George Floyd Global Memorial, an organization that is dedicated to preserving the offerings left at the memorial and the story of the uprising. Jeanelle holds a master's in Intercultural Studies and a Master of Divinity from Fuller Theological Seminary. So this conversation, I'm telling you guys, it was pretty great. So we're excited to share it.
Yeah, definitely.
We're live. Thank you so much for joining us, Jeanelle. So we were just chatting about this before we started recording because I'm sure there's a lot to say with this first question, but can you tell us a little bit about yourself and your journey to where you are now? So just how you got to where you're sitting today, whatever comes to mind. And I'm sure with that question, you'll integrate, academics and career projects, and yeah, kind of how you ended up in the role that you're in today. And if you could share what that position is.
Absolutely. So you actually added a lot more context to that question, because had you just left it at, could you tell us a little bit about yourself, I would have probably responded like, I love cloud watching. I believe that ice cream makes the world go round and cookies help it. Because I can be petty like that. But yeah, I was born and raised in Minneapolis, Minnesota. I am number 4 of 7 children. And I I grew up in a Christian home, and my parents put us through Christian schools, which is a whole experience in and of itself. And I ended up going to Messiah College, which is now Messiah University, when I went to undergrad, and I majored in Christian ministries with a focus in global studies, because I thought that I was going to be a missionary somewhere around the world. Like, I loved cultures, I loved traveling. I had started traveling internationally when I was 13. I loved people. My backup plan was going to be international business, because I still wanted to be able to go somewhere in the world. Like that's where I was at 18. I graduated and ended up going to Fuller Theological Seminary to do a Master's of Arts in Intercultural Studies, where I graduated during the economic crash of 2008, 2009. So I was being offered a job by the school as an academic advisor, and I took it because everybody else was getting laid off, and here I was being offered a job. Even though it wasn't my most favorite job in the world, I was like, it's a job, it'll pay my bills. And I gave them 2 years. I said, I will do this for 2 years because that's all I can handle. Well, I was there for 7. And I was an academic advisor for 7 years. Ended up being a manager in that capacity. But I transitioned, still worked at the school, but I transitioned from that job to being the director of operations for the Pinnell Center for African American Church Studies. And that job was really interesting because it allowed me to get outside of the office and into the community, and really navigating that balance between how do we as an institution really engage the world around us in light of everything that was happening. So um, I was appointed in 2015. So that's like in the aftermath of Ferguson, uh, of the Ferguson uprising with the murder of Mike Brown in 2014. And there was just so much unrest in our bodies. And having to provide leadership in that kind of space. And then in 2015, I believe Sandra Bland, that's the year Sandra Bland was murdered. And then in 2016, Alton Sterling, Philando Castile, like, and Freddie Gray. We're also dealing with the Orlando nightclub shooting. We're dealing with like all of this stuff that's happening in our society. And I'm in this position where I have a kind of responsibility to not just care for the fact that it's happening in society and that it matters for the institution, but how do I care for students Black students in particular, Black students who are training to be pastoral leaders or spiritual leaders, um, and are navigating this mess. And that was an extremely difficult season. um, an extremely difficult season. So I burned out. I burned out hard, and I think I recognized that I had burned out by uh, November of 2016. And I remember I went into my boss's office, with every intention to quit. But then I felt like God got a hold of me and that I couldn't quit. And so instead, I walked into his office, I sat down, and I said, I want to quit, but I can't quit because God won't let me, and I need you to tell me what to do. Now, that's not really the way you start a conversation off with your boss. But I had enough, and I was just like, this is me. This is where I am. Ball's in your court. Figure it out. And he said,
Mm.
why don't you take like 3 weeks vacation for Christmas? Like, take a break and come back, and we'll talk about it in the new year. And so I did. I took a break. New Year came. We never talked about it. And I continued to spiral downward. By 2018, I had absolutely enough, and I quit my job. And I packed up my apartment and I drove to Austin, Texas. Not because I had any opportunity there, but because I had a dream. I had a dream that I was supposed to move to Austin, Texas, like back in January. And so I was like, all right, I'm moving to Austin. So I moved to Austin, Texas. Yeah, I was just kind of like in between homes and spaces and trying to figure out what am I going to do with my life. I went to a chiropractor, did a stress test. He was like, Jeanelle, you have tested off the charts and I can't help you. So the best thing I can offer is that you go for long walks and take deep breaths until you bring your stress levels down. So that's what I did. For 6 months, I slept and I went for long walks and I took deep breaths. And then after 6 months, I woke up and I decided to get to know the city to which I moved. And I started getting involved. I got involved with this organization called Austin Health Commons, which looked at the intersection between race and health. I got involved with Dell Medical School. They had just hired on a new associate dean for public health, Dr. Jewel Mullen. And I started going to these forums she was hosting around race and public health. Because after having experienced that level of severe burnout, I had questions around how do we actually pursue racial justice and protect our health at the same time? Like, I didn't believe that the only way we could fight for racial justice was to go through extreme burnout. And I ended up actually taking some like business courses that were free and open to the community to set myself up to open my own consulting firm on racial justice, which I've been doing racial justice consulting and designing programs and things like that since college. So I had several years under my belt, maybe around 15 years at the time. And so I decided that I would um, build my company off this idea that we could pursue racial justice without burning out severely. And I had to really think through, like, how's that possible? Well, what do you do? And I went to, like, I don't know how I got through this process, but I concluded that joy is a kind of sustainable energy. And if somehow we could figure out how to pursue racial justice with joy, that we wouldn't have to start with anger, rage, fear, frustration, anxiety, and all those things that typically get us off the couch to go do something. And in that, um, in that process, I decided that I would use Clifton Strengths Finders for my clients to figure out what were they naturally good at. Because I had asked myself the question, well, how does one produce joy? Like, if joy is the source of energy, so I compared it to like complex carbohydrates versus sugar. Sugar will give you a high and then a crash, but complex carbohydrates give you more sustainable energy. And so it wasn't that those other energies were bad, and they were necessary sometimes to actually get people going, but they weren't sustainable. And so, well, then how do you generate joy? I remember thinking to myself, I said, you know what? The thing that always gives me joy is when I do something that I know that I'm good at. And it has this kind of feedback of joy, like, yeah, I did that. Yeah, I got that done. And so, what does it look like then to lean into people's strengths, and help people understand their strengths and who they are, and encourage them to do what they're already naturally good at, and lend their agency for the practice of racial justice. Um, so that way it's easier to actually do the work. So it's not like, because one of the things I had observed over the years is that whenever it was time for institutions or organizations to say, oh, now we need to do racial justice work, people would get all weird and funny, like, oh gosh, here we go again. Or they'll dig their heels in the ground, like, I'm not doing it. You're adding to my workload. I don't want to do this. And so I wanted to create a way that would make it easier for people to actually understand that racial justice is a way of life. It's not an outcome to a particular event. It's not something that should be added to your workload. It's something that we all should be like thinking about, engaging, practicing. It should be common. It should be natural to say, oh, let's do the right thing. um, Justice in itself, just not just racial justice, but justice is a way of life. So, um, so yeah, I decided to use Clifton Strength Finders as a base to help people understand their strengths. I did a lot of coaching around language, racial language, to get people more comfortable with language, because really, when we're really thinking about so much of our population is white folks, they don't grow up talking about race around the table like I did. They didn't grow up with a vocabulary to engage these kinds of conversations, which makes people extremely uncomfortable to engage these conversations because they don't even know where to begin or where to start or how to talk about it. I had one client tell me it was Black History Month coming up, and she had this really awkward conversation with one of her Black coworkers and was like, okay, so um yeah. And like, so she does all of this extra dramatics just to simply ask him, will you help me with the Black History Month planning? And she was so hyper concerned about sounding racist by asking a Black person to help her with the Black History Month planning that she made it even more awkward, right? And I looked at her and said, why didn't you just call me? That's what I'm here for. I would have given you the language to do it well. But now you're in a more awkward position because your coworker thinks you're crazy. And rightfully so. So yeah, but really, really helping people think like it doesn't have to be that hard. It's not rocket science to do the right thing, right? It just takes paying attention to each other, paying attention to the circumstances around us, and responding to it with our strengths. We say at George Floyd Square, bring your gifts to the square. So I mean, this was like a way bigger introduction that y'all had asked for, but I'm a storyteller, so that's your fault. I start and then I keep going. But yeah, so that's how I came to the space of creating Racial Agency Initiative. And then not long after I launched that, George Floyd was lynched, and my family invited me to come home to do my work here in Minneapolis. I said no because one thing I learned about both community organizing and pastoral work is that they're very similar in that people become very territorial. And I didn't want to navigate that. So I was like, no. And then my family asked me again and said, no, we really want you to come home. And I assumed that it was because my dad had just died a year prior. And it was a lot. It was a lot to really navigate that much loss, that much trauma, that much pain. Like our city was on fire. The air smelled like bonfire. There was military marching through the streets. There was a lynching in basically our backyard. It was less than a quarter mile away, 2.5 blocks, walking distance, short blocks. So it was a lot. It was a lot for our family to handle. And I think my family, we do better when we are all together. So I came home with 1 week's worth of clothing. I flew, and I thought I'd be here for 2 weeks. And I just kind of threw myself in the protests. The protests triggered all my trauma from LA. So I was like, I can't do this. And so I started tending to the memorial as my form of protest. I got up 6 a.m., June 1st, and just started picking up trash because it was healing. Like I had to somehow release the trauma in my body. And I was like, I could pick up trash, I could straighten up flowers, I could straighten up protest signs and make the memorial aesthetically pleasing for people who are coming to grieve so that there would not be a distraction. And so I just started doing that every day as my form of protest. And I knew that memorials could be a form of protest because when I was at Fuller, we had set up a memorial on the front steps of the institution. And it was extremely disruptive. Like I remember getting a call from the president and he was like, Jeanelle, people keep calling me and asking me to take it down. And I'm like, okay, it's not coming down. He's like, I know, I'm supportive of you all, but I just want to let you know there's a lot of pressure. I'm like, okay. Like I really didn't care. I'm like, Black people are dying. Like, deal with it. Walk around. And so I knew that memorials could be disruptive. What I didn't know was that memorials could grow to the size of a city block. And so it just kept growing. and growing. And every day the memorial looked different. And it truly was a living memorial. As people kept bringing offerings, more kept coming. And so every day it was like there's more work to do. I will never forget 4th of July, because the 5th of July, I was like the only one awake because everybody had partied all night long. And I was sweeping the morning passage. So the morning passage is the list of names. It's like 168 names of people who've died unjustly to the police. And that happens to be the exact location where people decided to set off fireworks the night before. And so there was all this fireworks debris and dust and trash because people just think that the square would magically clean itself. And so I get up 5th of July. It's just me. It took me like 3 hours to clean the streets that morning. Like,
Oh my gosh.
with like a push broom and a city garbage can. Just it's a lot. But it's I begin to realize every day, like I was trying to decide, when do I go back to Texas? When do I return back? My car was there, my stuff was there, I was still paying rent. And I remember the decision to stay because I realized there was just so much more work to do. And I couldn't just abandon the work to return back to the life that I thought I was trying to build for myself in Texas. So I decided to fly back to go get my stuff. I drove straight from Austin, Texas to Minneapolis. And I remember there was like a call, like a community call, that like town hall that the city, Andrea Jenkins had. And I chimed in from the car. And then I get to Minneapolis that afternoon just in time for the evening meeting at George Floyd Square. I show up at the evening meeting at 7 p.m. And then that following morning, I show up at a meeting with the council member, and I met Council Vice President Jenkins for the first time face to face. And that was the morning where Justice Resolution 001 was birthed, because we were asked the question, what does justice look like? And we went up and down the streets in the community asking people the question, what does justice look like? All of that is the precursor to where I am today.
Wow. Thank you so much for sharing. There are so many pieces of that I want to unpack. And yeah, I almost don't even know where to begin. But yeah, but I would love to hear more about your practice of caring for George Floyd Memorial and the square, and what you noticed that doing. You kind of spoke to what it did to yourself and how it was healing, and how it was so much more than just picking up trash, that it symbolized something greater. I wonder what you observed it doing to and for the community, and did others join you in that process of preservation and care? What did that look like for the wider community, honoring the space in the way that you did?
Absolutely. So I think it must be told that I was not the first person to start tending to this to the square, because, like, as I said, I didn't start till June 1st, because before I was like protesting, boots on the ground, well, let's get it in. And then my trauma pushed me into the square. So there were people who were there already tending to the space, because I realized that the morning people who were attending to it were a lot of people who were like, we can't be in big crowds because of COVID. And so this is what I can do. I can come early in the morning when there's nobody here and help tend to the space. I just happened to be one of the people who lived the closest and could show up every day. And I owned my own company. So I just looked at it as me donating my company time. like, so I had the privilege to use my time to do that. Not everybody had that privilege. Some people had to go back to work, right?
Yeah.
So I was one of the most consistent because I had privilege in owning my own company, and living so close. But there was also Paul, who was retired. Paul was an older retired white man, who was also coming every day. And eventually we started talking to each other because we're like, wait a minute, we're seeing each other every single day. And he felt strongly that he needed to defer to my leadership because he was like, this is a time for Black people to be centered. And so whenever someone would come and say, hey, can I help? How can I volunteer? He would say, go ask that girl over there. Like, he didn't even know my name. He was like, go ask that girl. And me being a former director of operations, being asked for people being asked to do something, I was like, I have to create something for them to do. Like I have to create a system that will help people volunteer and volunteer consistently. So that's where my brain was going. So I just started creating guidelines to make sure that everything was consistent. And then at the end of the day, like, I think there was like 7 guidelines, but after onboarding so many people, like the 2 that really stuck and stayed consistent turned out to be more like principles. And that was 1, everything is somebody's offering, therefore nothing is thrown away. And 2, the people are more sacred than the memorial itself. We didn't want people throwing away other people's offerings. Like, if it got caught by the wind, that's one thing. But people deciding, oh, this is ugly, or oh, this doesn't belong, or like, that was not for us to decide. This is somebody had already said this is a sacred space. And so I came into this space with a religious education background saying, okay, I know sacred spaces. And in sacred spaces, people bring offerings. So all of these things that people are bringing, I started just identifying as offerings. And you just don't throw away offerings. That is not okay. That is a no-no in religions across the world. And so I just had to instruct caretakers, if you're going to help, you don't get to throw anything away, period. End of story. So we started storing stuff as it became overwhelming in the bus shelters. And we decided to compost flowers so they wouldn't be thrown in the trash, but at least they would go back into the earth, right? If they were decaying, because they couldn't be in the space because they would, as they were decaying, they would develop mold, and mold would be a public health issue. And the people are more sacred than the memorial, right? So we had to deal first with the health of the people. And how do we navigate the memorial, not because of its aesthetics, but because it needs to provide wellness for the people. But that also meant that as we were tending to the space, if somebody had a question, we actually had to be able to turn around and tend to the person rather than the space. Or if someone needed to vent, we needed to tend to the person rather than the space. And I had to coach caretakers on how to do that. Now, I didn't start calling people caretakers. The community started calling us caretakers. And then the community started calling me lead caretaker because I was showing up every single day. So the names just kind of grew on us.
Yeah.
But there were days when there were 2 of us. And then now I think on my list, there's about 50. So, yeah. And not 50 people are attending to the memorial every single day, but people are doing what they can with the time that they have and the moment that they have. And people tend to the space in different ways. Some people pick up garbage and cigarette butts. Some people straighten up the memorial. Some people straighten up, say their names. Some people tend to the gardens. Some people tend to fixing things that need to be built. Like, people tend to the space in different ways. So, yeah. So that's where we are with caretakers. And it's a volunteer run operation. I think at some point, I think last August, we calculated that we had over 20,000 hours of volunteer hours.
Wow.
So definitely by now it's way more. But yeah, collectively, like our neighborhood, we put in the work to sustain the memorial. For context, my understanding that the beloved community is a phrase that Dr. Martin Luther King used a lot in his writings and in his speeches to really talk about this idea of the kind of society in which we want to live, where Black people, white people, rich people, poor people, all kinds of people can come and live together and thrive together and live in harmony, truly. I think that what's important to understand about the beloved community is that it's an idea that requires a lot of hard work. What I've learned in these past 21 months, the work of building community is some of the most difficult work that we will ever engage in our entire life, because we have to learn how to live with people we do not like. We have to learn how to respect people that we would otherwise never have engaged. We have to learn how to empathize with people that we have been conditioned to despise. That is not easy. That is not easy at all. And I think oftentimes the term community gets watered down, tossed back and forth. It gets misused, it gets abused, both by government entities and by just everyday people. And that work of really bringing people together to unify towards a common vision is heavy lifting work. And the word beloved, with the root word being love, that's heavy work too. It is not easy to love people.
Right.
It just isn't. We are by nature beings that want to protect our own bodies, that want to protect ourselves. That means that I have to learn to put down my instincts to care for another's need. And
Right.
that is the love. The love is not saying you need to speak my language. The love is the work of learning how to speak another's language. So to build a beloved community in a society that is extremely diverse means that we have to be able to lay down whatever it is that we are holding close and holding tight because it makes us feel all right, so that somebody else can feel better and welcomed and feel like they belong. That is not easy. That is engaging in some of the deepest waters of vulnerability, because we have to be able to trust that as I make myself vulnerable to make somebody else strong, that somebody else in my community is going to make themselves vulnerable to make me strong. That's the work of community. It's not easy, which is why some people choose not to participate, because it's easier not to participate.
Right.
It's easier to fly solo. It's easier to do what is convenient for self-sufficiency and self-sustainability.
Right.
Yeah. So that's what I think about the beloved community. I think it's a lot of work. And it's a lot of work that in a society where we depend on convenience, um, that most people aren't willing to do, which is why we don't have it.
Right. And it's so interesting that it just to your point, it does require something different from all of us, because different things make each of us uncomfortable. And so in that way, it's a community, because, and thinking back to what you're doing with strength finders, just kind of drawing out, and then thinking back to George Floyd Square and the memorial, and how everybody plays a different role in the same way in order to create the beloved community. We're all skilled differently, but then also different things make us uncomfortable, and we're challenged in different ways, and we have to grow into those areas as well as, you know, utilize our skills and particular giftings. I'm curious what your thoughts are on where the work of creating beloved community begins, whether it begins with, you know, individuals, entire communities, systems, if it all happens at once.
It begins by doing the next right thing. I think
Mm,
times we we sell ourselves short by thinking that we have to accomplish this like big task, right?
yeah.
I had someone engage with me over um, happy hour, and I was going to say drinks, but I don't drink because I'm allergic to alcohol. So I was like, what happened? It was happy hour. I engaged with someone over happy hour, and they had indicated to me that they wanted to take over the government. And they thought what we were doing at George Floyd Square was amazing. And they wanted to learn all that they could so they could take the values and the principles that we had at George Floyd Square and use that to take over the government.
Mm.
And I just kind of looked at him and was like, well, that's ambitious.
Mm. Right.
And not likely to actually be successful. So let's start small, right? Let's just start with doing the next right thing.
Yeah.
Within your scope of influence, what do you see? What can you do? Is the next right thing is helping an elder cross the street over an icy road? Is the next right thing is pulling over your car and helping someone push their car out of the road because it died?
Mm.
um, is the next right thing standing up for someone who's being bullied? Um, what's the next right thing? Like what do you see? Is the next right thing is responding to an emergency call of one of your neighbors, right? To make sure that they're okay. Um,
Right.
is the next right thing is checking in on a crying child? What's the next right thing? And I think when we start small, we develop our muscles and our capacity to be able um, to practice justice.
Mm.
I ran a few marathons while I lived in LA. And one of the things I learned is that you cannot wake up in the morning and decide that you're going to run a marathon and go out and run 26.2 miles.
Yeah.
Not going to happen. There's a reason why the first guy who ran the marathon died after he did it.
Gosh.
So you have to train your body. You have to condition your muscles. You have to condition your mind to be able to sustain that level of work. In the same way as I've already identified that the engagement and the participation in a beloved community is work, means that we have to start small. We have to start where we at. We have to start where we have the capacity
Yeah.
to love. Dr. Bill Pinnell, um, the man after whom the center I worked for is named,
Mm-hmm.
he said to me, do what you can with what you've been given. Do what you can with what you've been given.
Mm.
That requires self assessment, self reflection. Who am I? Where am I? What is my capacity? But then it also requires social awareness and reflection. What is around me? What is happening? What can I do? Right? So
Yeah.
rather than asking it like, well, what can I do? No, what can I do?
Mm.
How do I identify something that I can pick up? When I started tending to the memorial, I was like, you know what? It's dirty. There's chicken bones on the ground. It needs to be swept. So let me sweep it up. Right?
Mm.
That's something that I can do. And I think sometimes it just takes opening our eyes and paying attention
Yeah.
to ourselves and paying attention to others. identifying what we can do and do it. Do the next right thing. That's the beginning point of building a beloved community.
Yeah. That is such a amazing response. I really, really like that. I really like that. Well, I don't want to take too much more of your time. There are a zillion more questions I would like to ask, but I think, and then anything else that you want to share, you're free to. But I think I would be curious to hear the final question that, sometimes we like to end on with this series is like, where in your community and nation, world, however you define that, are you dreaming for this vision of beloved community to really ignite transformative change? And what would a community look like if it fully embraced this vision? And you're free to answer in whatever way you choose. But I, just in kind of, doing a little bit of research before our conversation, I found the organizing in Minneapolis that you're doing around the loss of Amir Locke's life. And I wonder, you don't have to place it within that particular context, but yeah, I guess just, yeah, with what you're investing in now, what do you think?
Right. So I think we need to talk about Amir Locke.
Okay.
Because Amir Locke died unjustly. Amir Locke's name was not on that warrant, and they tried to call him a suspect to create a kind of social imagination of who he was, character smear him before he even had a chance to be known or what his name was. Amir Locke died within 2 seconds of waking up because, as a licensed registered gun owner, he had a gun in his hand and somebody was kicking the couch that he was sleeping on. Woke him up. They saw the gun and shot him dead. I don't know, like, in whose world is that a beloved community?
Right.
Like, let's take the conversation of public safety and policing away, right? And let's just say that those men who were given consent to enter into that apartment building and that young man sleeping on that couch all belong to the same beloved community.
Mm-hmm.
Is that how you treat a person in your beloved community? Right?
Right.
And I think when we frame it that way, it shows the deficit of how far we are from the idea of a beloved community. The ethics complaint that we just launched as residents to hold our mayor accountable, again, it's a stepping stone to get some kind of accountability. But that gets us nowhere near a beloved community. What does love look like? Dr. Cornel West says justice is what love looks like in public. Doing the right thing. I define justice as the process of making things right. So this work of doing the right thing. We're human. We're always going to mess up. We're always going to cause harm. But what do we do when we cause harm? And how do we make sure that those harms that we have caused are not circling back and causing another harm again, right? We are far from a beloved community. And so the work that we do at George Floyd Square as neighbors is just that. How do we do the next right thing? How do we respond to somebody's ask for help? How do we um, stand up for people who are socially marginalized? How do we speak out against actions that are anti-love?
Yeah.
How do we speak out against systems that are anti-love, right? How do we do the next right thing in hopes that it will inch us toward a beloved community? We say, one of the chants that we say all the time is, show me what community looks like. This is what community looks like. Show me what community looks like. This is what community looks like. Love has to be witnessed. Love is not just a feeling. It's not just words. Love has to be witnessed. Show me love. And I think if we can at least begin to commit ourselves to that kind of act of, how do I show love in this moment, we'll inch towards a beloved community. The deficit is great, but we can inch there. And in many ways, when I think about the ethics complaint that we launched, that is an act of love. The act of accountability, that's an act of love, right? To say that the actions caused us to lose a life, and therefore we need to begin the work of righting that wrong. That's the work of justice. Justice is the work of love. But we have to center. We have to center people first, right? We have to center the kind of people we want to become together first. Right. Because otherwise things can easily be dismissed as political. Things can easily be dismissed as, well, you just don't like me, you've never liked me, or you're just trying to do a smear campaign, as opposed to, no, this is about love and accountability. This is about community building. And it hurts, and it's hard, but it's necessary for us to become the kind of community we need to be to save lives. Right. That's at the root of it. But people's instinct are, again, the individual protection. How do I protect myself? Right. How do I survive this? Amir did not survive. When are we going to start talking about how do we survive this environment that we have created for each other? And if we can't all survive it together, then we need to change something. Right. Period. The only death should be of natural causes. Period. And so if we are not surviving the society that we have built for ourselves, then we need to do something different. Yeah. And if someone has decided that the power that they have achieved as an individual is more important than us surviving, then that person needs to move or be moved. That person does not get thrown from community. Let us be clear. Right. But that person just gets relocated in the community into a place where they can be more productive for community. Right. Right? Your strengths. What are your strengths? If you do not have the strength to lead in such a way where people are not unnecessarily dying, then you do not need to be leading in that capacity. Right. Or in any capacity. We need to start asking those deep, fundamental questions about how we construct our way of life. These are moral questions. I mean, I did my MDiv in ethics, so yes, EDH, I know well.
Yeah.
So, these are deep ethical questions about society building and people building, right? I did an entire degree in intercultural studies, which is about engaging people um, who speak different languages and have different cultures and have different approaches to life. Like, we need to start holding that in serious ways if we really want to stop these public lynchings, if we really want to end racism, if we really want to do better, and not just be a better Minneapolis, but really be a better America, because this has been 400 years and counting, and enough is enough.
Right.
Like, we need to stop putting capitalism and personal gain over the wellness of people.
Right. Right. And we can do all of this from a place of joy, going back to what you were saying earlier.
Yeah. Leveraging our strengths. Bring your gifts to the square, we say. Like, let's bring your gifts to this movement. Bring your gifts to this moment in time. Like, bring your gifts. Who were you created to be? What are you just naturally good at? I like to tell my students, I'm like, who are you when you were 5 years old, and what came easy for you? That is what you need to be doing. You are who you have always been. Who are you when you were 10 years old? What came easy for you? That's what you need to be doing. Who are you before bills? Like, before you became creative, right? Who are you? What could you do? Like, when the world was your playground, when you could imagine to the stars, what came easy for you? And that's what I need you to tap into, because that's the best of who you are. Who are you when your only responsibility was to play? Bring me that person. Bring that gift to this moment in time. And I can guarantee you that together we will be great.
Well, that was such an amazing conversation. I feel so just grateful for everything that we've learned from Jeanelle and her story, which is just so rich and full of, such a long and deep journey that she's been on to get to where she is today. It's really cool to see that.
Right. I know. I totally agree. I really appreciate her starting the conversation with so much grounding of grounding / context of where she comes from and just the journey that she's been on. And, we were talking briefly, you and I were, and just struck by the same idea of her needing, after a period of time working and ministering to the students at Fuller, and doing justice work here in Pasadena, actually, which is where I am, at my alma mater as well, and just that being exhausting and that taking a toll on her, being in this peace, justice work, and her needing to take a break because she literally had nothing left to give. I think that definitely stuck out to me of how, and then I think it sparked within her like that question of how do we create this work in a way, or how do we do this work in a way that's sustainable, and that does not lead to exhaustion and burnout, and how can we do it leading with joy, and leading with our strengths, so that maybe it doesn't leave us like running ragged. But then also, I mean, when you're surrounded by pain and facing painful situations, like in traumatic situations, even, both firsthand and just secondary, like it's understandable. I don't know how you can always protect against that exhaustion or the toll it might take on your body and spirit.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. And I also appreciated how, just honestly and vulnerably she shared about her journey, because I think it is so important for so many people, I imagine, who are directly involved in that, that direct action work for justice and social equity. And yeah, and I think I really, like you're saying, kind of what she was sharing about the energy source of joy. But then I liked
Mm,
how she also said, like, there are other energy sources. Like sometimes you do need to be angry and that like motivates you.
mm,
But the sustainability comes from being able to like have joy and work from a place of joy. And yeah,
right.
and I think I really appreciated what she was saying about racial justice being a way of life and not just necessarily just actions that you take, though those would be a part of making that like a lifestyle, but it's
Right.
more about a way of being. And yeah, and she just put it so simply. It's like it's doing the right thing.
Right.
It's doing righteousness, and
Yeah,
that really yeah, I think just speaks to kind of both the complexity and the simplicity of it at the same time.
I totally agree. And she, obviously, as we're talking about all of this within the context of beloved community, I like that she she was um she said something about how, being pursuing beloved community means doing the next right thing. And she gave some super
Mhm,
practical examples for that. And, I don't even think that that's something that we've heard just from her, but I think it's been from a couple of our guests is like just doing the next thing, whatever that may be, whatever,
mhm. Yeah,
whoever, wherever, um,
yeah,
yeah, in your context, yeah, I think stripping it down, I mean, I think you said it perfectly. It is simple in some ways, but then, we can't ignore that, that
mhm.
sometimes it's not straightforward. Like, what is the next right thing?
Right,
Thinking about her specific experience in, George Floyd Square and tending to the items that were left at the memorial and holding on to them. And she at one point was talking about how everyone was doing something different, and so some people were preserving, some people were making the memorial look visually pleasing, and then others were fixing things that were broken, or sweeping, cleaning. It was a cool illustration of like that's what the beloved community looks like. And maybe in all of those, for all of those people, that seemed like the next right thing, was to like build something.
right,
Well, that's something I can do. That's the
right,
right thing for me to do. I can,
totally.
I'm creative, I can make this look good. That's my next right thing. So it's interesting how
Right.
like all of our next right thing
Mhm.
probably won't be the same thing. Maybe even
Yes,
it could be related
totally.
to each other, but
Right.
yeah, thought that was cool.
Yeah, I love that too. And she was talking about like the strengths finder and how helping people find their strengths and then using those strengths for within this context of racial equity. And
Right.
yeah, and I think that's that's such a good point what you're bringing up too, because I think it can also look different for each of us as we deepen our journeys of
Mhm.
like working towards beloved community. And um maybe there's a season where it's you're called to post things on social media and you feel really compelled to be doing that and using that platform. But then as you
Right.
move into more like in-person work or relationships or efforts, that maybe that's where the work is and that's where you're doing the right thing. um Not that you stop using your other platforms, but it's kind of like, yeah, like deepening
Yeah.
that work and what that looks like. And or I'm sorry, not work, way of life, way of being,
Right. Right.
and what that looks like.
Right.
So yeah, I think there's different skills and gifts that we and strengths that we have, and then there's also like different seasons of what are maybe what doing the right thing looks like um, in our current context.
Mhm.
So yeah,
Right. Yeah, absolutely. I think,
so grateful for Janelle. She's
yeah,
amazing.
me too. I stumbled upon this quote that I wanted to read from Janelle. And it says, the answer to anti-Blackness, the answer to racism is building stronger communities. And what I've learned over the past 10 months is that building stronger communities is rooted in the decisions we make to be a neighbor. It's so simple. We make it far more complex than it needs to be. And I don't know, that's just encouraging to me. Or I found that very both practical and profound of
Mhm.
just that concept of like what does it mean to be a neighbor, and that just asking that question in our respective communities is a way towards that's like as she says, like the answer to anti-Blackness, the answer to racism. So I don't know what that might
Yeah.
look like for different people, but I mean here in my community, it's a story that's being played out, not just here, but all over the country of low income families. Many like families of color are being pushed out because the just as housing costs
Mhm.
skyrocket and get higher and higher, that's ultimately what it's doing. How do we build stronger communities? Yeah.
Yeah, and like coming alongside those who maybe do need a solidarity, they do need an ally to come alongside them.
Right.
And yeah, so good. Now that we're talking about this, I'm also reflecting on even just my own journey of like, yeah, what it looked like to participate in protests in the summer of 2020,
Mm,
and then doing this like, art, prayer, empathy table with other church members in DC, and trying
mm,
to kind of like be a presence in the community and show that, Christians support the fight for racial justice, or Christians,
right.
are present and see and hear and are with like the people who are crying out for justice. Um, and
Mm,
definitely like a lot of social media activism. And then I think for me, I started to reach that sort of point of like, okay, like what's next? Like what is the
yeah.
next right thing? Um, and that's when my husband, Justin, and I came across this nonprofit called Justice and Equality in
Mm,
DC that's Black led and like Black leadership team. It's based in a Black church called Revolution Church DC, and they are working directly on issues affecting predominantly the Black community in the city, like issues of justice and nonviolence and
wow.
like preventing violence among youth. Yeah. And so they were
Mhm.
basically calling for volunteers. And so both Justin and I felt compelled or called to go deeper in that way and to say,
Cool.
like, okay, we're going to follow this organization and these people who are leading this movement and this group and see how we can kind of serve alongside them in that way. So I think, yeah, just to like give a practical example, like, because I think
Mm,
it can be confusing, but like looking
yeah.
for those opportunities and yeah, and just seeing what is in your sphere of in your community that maybe you could be
Right.
contributing to. Yeah. So
Right. What's
yeah.
available. Yeah, I love that. Thank you for sharing
Yeah.
that. That was a lot of that was new to me. I didn't know that you were part of that. And I think that's just such a great example of like it was. I mean, I'm not minimizing at all what you guys did, but a lot of it was showing up, was seeing who, like you said, who was available, and then just committing and showing
Right.
up, and being willing to learn and
Yes.
to listen. And I mean, that's not easy work. So,
Yeah, I think it can be hard sometimes to figure out, okay, well, what's my action step? And not everybody can commit themselves to an
right.
organization in that way, but maybe you can, financially support. And I think there is something
Mhm.
to, yeah, like Janelle was talking about sort of that process of like transformation and just being willing to like go through that. And like you're saying, like put yourself in a position to listen and learn and then
Right.
sort of like yeah, let that flow out from you in your current context and relationships.
Man, such a good conversation. So thankful for Janelle.
If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe, rate, and review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and wherever you listen to podcasts. And for more info about Peace Catalyst and to help support our peace building work, please visit our website at peacecatalyst.org.